Welcome back to another episode of the Gaming Graveyard. Maybe you remember just a few episodes ago when I mentioned
put on this show eventually. I just don't want another EA game. It's too soon.
well, EA apparently just can't leave my mind, as once again we will be covering the Electronic of Arts. We will also be covering Visceral Games, who, ironically enough, was also mentioned in that same video.
Only got a couple casualties under their belt. Visceral Games, Bullfrog, Origin. Oh, just throw them up there. There's quite a few of them.
This is a story about EA trying something new when EA never tried something new. It's also a story about how not to grow an IP from the ground up. So without further ado, let's get into the definitely not System Shock 3 game known as Dead Space, and its horrible third entry, Dead Space 3. The beginning of Dead Space as an IP starts in and around 2005, with Redwood Shores, a subsidiary of EA, beginning their concept work on a game that they were dubbing System Shock 3. Ultimately, the team sat down and they played the System Shock games, and that's what they were going to make. And then that was until Resident Evil 4 released, and Redwood sat down to play it, and almost immediately they fell in love. Their minds shifted away from the traditional slow-paced horror of System Shock and towards a more fast-paced yet still horror-filled game like Resident Evil 4. It, however, was internally being called System Shock for about another year until the team finally dropped the System Shock name and just embraced the fact that this was going to have to be a new IP. And yeah, they weren't confident EA was going to let them make a new IP. But to pretty much everybody in the entire world's surprise, EA decided to say screw it, let's make Dead Space happen. And they had a good reason for it as well. RE4 was a phenomenon in the industry. It was a smash hit, and EA was hoping that if Dead Space could maybe come out pretty fucking soon, they could get some of those sales.
I want to see all your money.
Excuse me?
Show me where the money lives.
Because, yeah, they planned on making Dead Space at least relatively similar to RE, and that was how they're going to market it, is that RE4 is going to be really fucking similar to Dead Space. Dead Space's development was relatively smooth, considering the fact that it's a brand new IP from a team that had never really worked on its own IP before. They were doing pretty solid. Dead Space would officially release on October 13th of 2008 and would sell over 1 million copies worldwide, and for a brand new IP, it's not half bad. For EA though, it's just simply not worth it. They needed more sales, they needed more copies moved, and they were going to give Redwood Shores another chance. So they did greenlight the sequel. However, Redwood Shores would now be renamed to Visceral Games, and well, they were going to be looking forward to hopefully improving upon the first one. Unfortunately, the now renamed Visceral Games immediately found out that EA may have greenlit the sequel, but oh boy, did they have some demands for the sequel. EA demanded some sort of multiplayer mode. The Visceral Games team argued that this was an unnecessary use of their resources and the fans didn't really care about it. Visceral would soon find out that this wasn't really a suggestion, and EA was certainly demanding. As one team member at Visceral said, there really isn't a choice whether you want to add a multiplayer mode or not. If you say no, your game is basically canceled. The core reason EA wanted a multiplayer mode is that they blamed the sales of the game on the fact that there was no multiplayer mode, and they felt that a single player game simply wasn't profitable. For a multitude of reasons, this makes no sense, as of course some of the most profitable marketable brands in the industry are single player only games, or at least primary focus is single player. Games like BioShock, Cyberpunk, The Witcher, The Last of Us, God of War, Alan Wake, Life is Strange, and the mainline Fallout entries are all single player. But EA wasn't going to budge, so it really didn't matter. Everyone hold your breath because you may never hear this again. I will give EA a bit of credit. They were asking for more things to be put into the sequel, but they gave Visceral quite the sizable budget increase. The marketing push was certainly also increased as they wanted to see more profit, so it wasn't like EA was just throwing Dead Space into the void and hoping it succeeded. They were trying. They also greenlit spin-offs and action figures, comic books. I mean, they were trying their ass off to make Dead Space a thing. Unfortunately, building up an IP using action figures and spin-offs and comic books isn't the way to do it. EA wanted the next big thing, and Dead Space, I'm sorry to say it to all those fans out there, is just simply not the next big thing. It was supposed to be Resident Evil in space. That's all it had to be. That was all it ever needed to be. But EA wanted it to break away from that. It wanted it to be bigger and badder than Resident Evil, and that was just simply never going to happen. Dead Space 2 would finally come out in December 21st of 2010, and the game clearly took a lot of interest from Resident Evil. Why? Well, because around that time, Resident Evil was picking up a little bit more action and dropping a little bit more horror. Dead Space did the same. The game wasn't bad though, as it was actually critically acclaimed by the critics, and many fans seen it as a really good sequel to a really good game. Ironically enough, you know what mode didn't get played? The multiplayer. EA doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about. Although they may have no clue what they're talking about, they're the ones that hold the money. So for Visceral, seeing them see their game as a failure was disappointing. The game moved around 2 million copies from the previous game's 1 million. Due to the increase in budget, and I mean sizable increase in the budget, this wasn't a big enough increase for EA.
It's me. Knock knock. So, you got my money?
Huh? Oh, yeah, I'll pay you soon.
Yeah, well, here's a suggestion. Have the money by tomorrow and there won't be any problems.
Although EA did want to give it one more chance, and they did want to keep Visceral going on this Dead Space IP, as they seen that there was still money to be made, they were going to have a lot more say over what the next game was going to do. They were also not going to give Visceral nearly the amount of money that they gave them last time. There was also going to be co-op. That was not an argument. There was going to be microtransactions. That's not an argument. Otherwise, the game was just going to be straight up canceled. With all these things working against Visceral, they also know that EA wants a sizable increase in copies sold, otherwise the IP is going to be killed off anyway. So Visceral did what they seen as a necessary evil, and they slowly chopped out all of the horror. They were going all in on action-based affairs, as they believed that would help sell the game to more people. Very early in the game's development, they decided to add a crafting system, a very complex crafting system at that. Unfortunately, Visceral was told to dumb it down, as EA didn't feel that this crafting system being as complex would be very marketable, and they were also told to add microtransactions to it. So over the game's development, it slowly got dumbed down further and further until it was just as easy to understand as the rest of the game. There was also clashes with EA about the story, with Visceral feeling that the story should embrace the co-op nature of the game and write it into the actual story itself, the idea of Isaac having some sort of split personality, also having his mental health slowly deteriorate over time. They also planned on having cutscenes be different for both players to add an extra layer to the co-op identity of the game. It was all supposed to add just another level to the genre, but unfortunately, just as more horror got removed, this also got removed, as EA said no and quickly shot down the idea of Isaac having any sort of mental health problem. Why? Well, because they seen it as not very marketable.
Shh. No. Don't. Shush now, Frowny Horns.
Yay, every gamer's favorite word. Instead, they opted for a much more generic second character. The atmospheres were also going to have to change, with EA forcing a co-op multiplayer to the game. Visceral had to change the game's dynamic and opted for more open layouts to accompany two main characters instead of the linear affair that they were more used to designing. The marketing was also not going well. Despite this game supposedly being the most marketable Dead Space due to EA's changes, it simply wasn't happening. Did you guys know that Dead Space 3 had pulping? I mean, it's pretty sick.
Freaking drill. Really cool. Necros getting pulped. Awesome. The pulping was super awesome. I like saying the word pulping. It's super awesome. Bits and body parts go flying and it's freaking cool. Really intense. Giant freaking drill. It could pulp you.
The game would continue its development just like that. Visceral would propose something, EA would shoot it down or revise it, and the game just kept losing more and more identity as the game went on. Heading into the game's release on February 5th of 2013, which is a terrible time to release a horror game, the sales were terrible. There is absolutely no solid sales numbers. All we know for a fact is that Dead Space 3, at its release and over its lifetime, has sold 20% less copies than Dead Space 2. It also got terrible reviews. Although not as bad as other games we might have covered previously, it wasn't great, getting the lowest review scores in the series by far. The overwhelming consensus from players and most reviewers was that the game felt less like a Dead Space game and more like a random thrown together action movie. Dead Space 3 is a reminder to many that you don't need to make every single IP the biggest and the baddest in the industry. It's okay to release an IP that isn't moving hundreds of thousands of copies in a day. Except, of course, it didn't teach anybody in the industry that lesson, because to this day, companies are still being shut down for not releasing a big budget, realistic AAA shooter or game in general 24/7. It's a sad realization in the industry that, simply put, AAA companies don't want to invest in indie-like games. Despite the fact that indie games constantly are becoming more and more popular year after year due to their simplicity, they simply can't be sold at a $70 price tag, and they also don't sell as many copies as a normal AAA product. Hopefully, big AAA companies will finally learn that you can release a small indie project to hold over your audience for a bigger budget game. Unfortunately, that seems unlikely, and it seems profit margins are always going to be prioritized over a good game. So, what are you gonna do?
And all you can talk about is money.
So moving forward, by the way, I want to have my second channel actually do something. So every game I cover on this channel, I will play 4 hours of that game on my second channel. And on Twitch, go follow me, link in the description below. I think it would be a nice touch to kind of play the games I cover instead of just talking about them, but I mean, who knows? I know this felt more like a overview of Dead Space instead of just Dead Space 3's video, but in order for you to understand Dead Space 3, I feel like the context of previous games was necessary. I also know that this was a very short gaming graveyard video, but I didn't want to drag it out, so without further ado, have a good one.